The Phoenix Syndicate had spent years ruling the streets through fear, extortion, and violence, believing that no one would ever dare to stand against them. When they set their sights on a small, underfunded clinic, they expected the same result as always: compliance. Dr. Malcolm Graves seemed like an easy target, just another overworked doctor too focused on saving lives to risk his own. They saw a man in his 40s, quiet, tired, dedicated to his patients, and assumed he would fall in line like the rest. They never considered the possibility that he had once been someone else. They didn't know about the years he had spent in war zones, tending to wounded soldiers under fire, learning to fight and survive in places where hesitation meant death. They had no idea that the man in the white coat had once been a combat medic, that his hands, steady from years of surgery, were just as capable of breaking as they were of healing. So when they stormed into his clinic, demanding supplies and obedience, they thought they were dealing with another helpless civilian. They were wrong. By the time the night was over, the Phoenix Syndicate would realize that some men don't break, some places won't fall, and that beneath the patience of a healer, there can be a warrior waiting. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe. The clinic buzzed with the steady rhythm of controlled urgency. The scent of antiseptic lingered in the air, masking the faint metallic tang of blood. The waiting room, though modest, was full. Mothers with sick children, an elderly man rubbing his knee, a woman clutching a tissue as she muffled her cough. Dr. Malcolm Graves moved through it all like a force of nature, precise and unwavering. In the back, beneath the harsh glow of fluorescent lights, a man lay on the examination table, his dress shirt peeled away, revealing an ugly gash along his ribs. Blood seeped through the white gauze that Nurse Nia Reynolds pressed against the wound, her jaw tight with concentration. "You're lucky," she murmured, shaking her head. "Another inch, and you'd be laid out in a morgue instead of on this table." The man, Dion Carter, a well-known convenience store owner in the neighborhood, winced but managed a weak chuckle. "Lucky," he echoed, coughing slightly. "Didn't feel like it when they had me on the ground." Dr. Graves approached, slipping on a fresh pair of gloves as he took in the wound. His sharp gaze moved from Dion's face to the injury, assessing everything with the practiced eye of a man who had seen much worse. "This happened today?" he asked, voice calm, measured. Dion nodded, his breath hitching as Nia adjusted the gauze. "Barely locked up my store before they rushed me. 5, maybe 6 of them. Wanted everything in the register, then started clearing out shelves like it was a damn shopping spree. Told me I should be thanking them for not killing me." Graves exhaled through his nose, steady but deliberate. "Did they say anything else?" "Yeah." Dion swallowed hard, shaking his head. "Said it's their neighborhood now, that anyone running a business has to pay up, or they'll start collecting in other ways." The room felt heavier. Graves pressed 2 fingers against Dion's wrist, checking his pulse, but his mind was elsewhere. This wasn't just some random robbery. It was something more deliberate, something worse. "Who was it?" Nia asked, though they all had a good guess. Dion sighed, grimacing as he turned his head slightly. "Pete's crew." A silence settled between them, thick and unspoken. Graves didn't say anything, didn't react beyond the slight tightening of his jaw. He simply reached for his tools, wordlessly preparing to stitch the wound closed. The work came first. Always. Whatever this meant for the clinic, that was a problem for later. The late afternoon sunlight filtered through the clinic's windows, casting slanted streaks across the scuffed linoleum floor. Outside, the neighborhood carried on as usual. The muffled sounds of a distant car stereo, the occasional laughter of children playing somewhere down the street, the rhythmic chatter of city life winding toward evening. But inside, the air had changed. The moment the 5 men stepped through the front doors, the room tensed, the easy rhythm of the clinic's routine grinding to an unnatural halt. A mother near the waiting area instinctively pulled her child closer, her fingers tightening around the boy's arm. An older man, sitting with his hands folded over his cane, dropped his gaze to the floor, suddenly interested in the worn-out pattern of the tiles. The leader of the group, Rico, walked in like he owned the place, his gaze sweeping lazily over the clinic's interior before settling on Dion Carter, who was still seated on the examination table, his ribs freshly bandaged. The smirk that tugged at the corner of Rico's mouth was all teeth and condescension, a silent acknowledgement that Dion had run here to escape them. "Damn, Dion," Rico murmured, shaking his head as if the sight genuinely amused him. "Thought we made it real clear earlier. You don't get to say no to us." Dion's shoulders stiffened, but he kept his mouth shut. Rico turned his attention toward Dr. Malcolm Graves, his smirk widening. "And you, Doc, well, you're gonna have to help us out." Graves had been watching, taking in every movement, every shift in body language, the way the men spread out just enough to exert control over the space. He pulled off his gloves with a calm, practiced motion, dropping them into the waste bin before meeting Rico's gaze. "If you're hurt," Graves said evenly, "you can take a seat, and I'll see what I can do for you." Rico exhaled sharply, shaking his head. Nah, see, that's not how this works. We ain't asking for treatment. We're telling you how it's gonna go." He gestured toward the shelves lining the back wall, where bottles of antibiotics, painkillers, and other essentials were neatly stacked. "You're gonna start setting some of that aside for us. Regularly. Bandages, meds, antibiotics, anything we need. And when we come in, you treat us first. No waiting, no charge, no questions." Nia Reynolds, who had been standing near the supply cabinet, her fingers tightening around a clipboard, spoke up before Graves could. "That's not how this clinic operates." Rico's gaze snapped to her, his amusement flickering to something sharper. "I don't think you heard me right," he said, his tone losing whatever civility it had been pretending at. "I wasn't asking." From his position near the entrance, EZ took a step forward, his presence shifting from passive observation to something more pointed. "You're done here," EZ said, his voice steady, firm. "Walk out before this turns into something you don't want." A low chuckle escaped Rico, his expression unreadable. "Oh, I don't want it." He turned his head slightly, as if checking with his crew, before letting out another dry laugh. "You hear that? EZ thinks he got the muscle to tell us what to do?" Slade, the man standing closest to the reception desk, clicked his tongue, shaking his head as he leaned against the counter. "Man, that's really funny coming from someone who used to run with us." EZ's jaw tightened, but his stance didn't waver. "That was a long time ago, and yet here you are," Rico mused, feigning deep thought, "still standing in the way of progress." Then, just like that, his expression shifted, amusement disappearing as if someone had flipped a switch. "Let's make this real simple," he said, his voice lower now, heavier. "You either hand over what we need, or we take it. But either way, we're walking out of here with something." Silence pressed into the room, thick and suffocating. Then, Tone moved. Fast. The pistol came out of his jacket, the barrel flashing as he pointed it straight at Dion's head. A woman near the waiting area gasped, a sharp intake of breath, her body curling around her child in silent panic. The teenage boy, who had been minding his own business near the back of the room, went rigid, his eyes darting between the gun and the door, calculating whether he could make it out in time. Dion barely breathed. Graves, however, did not react, not immediately. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. His hands, steady and controlled, rested casually at his sides, but his eyes were locked onto Tone's grip, the angle of his stance, the way his fingers twitched ever so slightly on the trigger. "Is this your idea of negotiation?" Graves murmured, his tone betraying nothing but calm indifference. "Because I can tell you right now, that's a terrible plan." Rico's smirk twitched, but his patience was wearing thin. "See, Doc," he sighed, feigning disappointment. "I don't think you understand your place here." He gestured lazily toward Tone. "Maybe you need a little reminder." Tone pressed the gun harder against Dion's skull, the threat now very, very real. From across the room, EZ moved first. His motion was subtle, a slow step forward, his hands at his sides, but the shift in energy was immediate. The muscles in his arms coiled, his posture changing from casual defense to something Graves had seen before. Something trained. Rico saw it too. His smirk faded. Graves, watching everything unfold in real time, saw the crack in Rico's composure. A split second of hesitation. That was all he needed. His hand struck Tone's wrist with calculated precision, twisting the gun just enough to throw off his aim. A shot rang out, the bullet sinking into the ceiling, sending patients ducking for cover. The deafening crack of the gunshot reverberated through the clinic, ricocheting off the walls like an explosion in an enclosed space. The sharp tang of burnt gunpowder filled the air, mingling with the sterile scent of antiseptic. Chaos erupted in its wake. The bullet had buried itself into the ceiling, sending small chunks of plaster cascading down like dust. Patients screamed, scrambling for cover, some diving behind chairs, others pressing themselves against the walls in a desperate bid to make themselves unseen. A woman near the reception desk clutched her child tightly to her chest, her eyes squeezed shut, whispering something frantic under her breath. Dr. Malcolm Graves's fingers had already closed around the wrist of the man who had fired, yanking it downward in a swift, decisive motion. Tone barely had time to register what had happened before a brutal elbow struck his face, crushing his nose with a sickening crunch. His body crumpled backward, hands instinctively flying up to his ruined face as blood poured between his fingers, his weapon clattering uselessly to the floor. Before the gun had even settled, EZ was already moving. He launched himself at Slade with the kind of force that came from years of knowing how to break a man without hesitation. His fist collided with Slade's jaw, sending him stumbling backward, crashing into the row of waiting room chairs. The plastic seats groaned under the sudden impact, skidding noisily against the floor. Rico, momentarily stunned by how quickly control of the situation had slipped from his hands, took a sharp step back. His smirk had vanished, his expression darkening as he reached for something inside his jacket. Graves saw it. He was already moving. Closing the distance between them in 3 precise strides, he grabbed Rico's wrist just as the gang leader began to draw a knife, twisting the limb with enough force to send the blade clattering to the ground. For the first time, true surprise flickered across Rico's face. The moment was fleeting. But Graves didn't give him the luxury of regaining his composure. He planted a knee into Rico's ribs, forcing the air from his lungs with a sharp, strangled grunt. The gang leader stumbled backward, his balance momentarily lost. Behind them, Slade recovered faster than expected, shaking off the blow from EZ. He reached into his waistband, pulling out a switchblade with a quick, practiced flick of his wrist. The sharp glint of metal caught the dim overhead lights, but before he could make use of it, EZ struck again. This time, he didn't aim for the face. His knee shot up, driving deep into Slade's stomach, folding him forward with a pained wheeze. The blade slipped from his grip, clattering to the floor with a metallic clang. Graves, still engaged with Rico, didn't let up. He could feel the muscles beneath his grip shifting, Rico struggling to twist free, attempting to turn the tide of the fight. But Graves had spent years in places where losing wasn't an option, where hesitation meant death. He wasn't about to hesitate now. With brutal efficiency, he slammed Rico's head against the reception desk, the sharp impact sending the man sprawling to the ground, his limbs momentarily slack. A choked sound of pain escaped him, but Graves wasn't finished. He pressed a knee against Rico's chest, keeping him pinned, his breathing measured, his pulse steady despite the chaos around him. From the corner of his eye, he saw Tone still writhing on the floor, blood pouring from his broken nose, making no attempt to rejoin the fight. Slade was hunched over, one hand gripping his stomach, the other still twitching toward his discarded weapon. EZ kicked the blade away. "Try it again," he warned, voice low, dangerous. "See how that works out for you." The gang members, who had come in feeling untouchable, were now struggling to stay upright. Rico wheezed beneath Graves's weight, his lips split, his brow furrowed in something between fury and disbelief. "You," he coughed, struggling against the pressure holding him down. "You really think this is over?" Graves, still unmoving, still as calm as he had been before this all began, stared down at him with an expression unreadable. "No," he murmured, voice low, deliberate. "I think this is the beginning of your biggest mistake." A sudden burst of movement near the door drew both their attention. One of the gang members, who had hung back, the youngest of the group, probably more talk than fight, had begun inching toward the exit, clearly deciding this wasn't worth the trouble. Nia, still standing near the locked supply room door, took a slow step forward. "Go." The young man hesitated, then bolted, shoving through the clinic's doors and disappearing down the street without a second glance. The others, beaten and humiliated, weren't far behind. Slade, still hunched over, muttered something under his breath before staggering toward the exit, one hand pressed against his ribs. Tone, still holding his ruined face, followed him, casting one last glare at EZ before slipping out the door. The only one left was Rico, still pinned beneath Graves. Still struggling to comprehend how the hell things had turned out like this, Graves finally released him, but not before leaning in slightly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Don't come back." Rico glared at him, his expression a twisted mix of anger and something dangerously close to humiliation. Without another word, he pushed himself up, wiping the blood from his mouth with the back of his hand before making his way toward the door. He stopped just short of the threshold, turning slightly, his expression unreadable. "This ain't over," he murmured, his voice carrying a quiet promise. Then, with one final glance at his fallen men, he stepped outside and vanished into the streets. The door swung shut behind him, and for the first time since the fight had started, the clinic was still. The only sound left was the quiet murmur of those who had been hiding, slowly peeling themselves off the floor, their bodies still rigid with the aftershock of what had just happened. Nia exhaled, her fingers trembling slightly as she brushed stray curls from her face. EZ flexed his hands, rolling his shoulders before casting a glance at Graves. Graves simply straightened his coat, exhaled slowly, and muttered the only thing that mattered now. "Lock the doors." The clinic had never been truly quiet, not with the steady hum of the city pressing against its thin walls, the occasional cough of a waiting patient, the rhythmic beep of a heart monitor in the back room, but now the silence was something else entirely. It was heavy, unsettled, waiting. Dr. Malcolm Graves stood near the reception desk, his pulse no longer racing, but his muscles still wired with the echoes of the fight. The adrenaline had begun to fade, but the tension had not. The clinic had seen blood before, but never like this. Not as a warning, not as a challenge, not as a promise of something worse to come. Nia Reynolds had finally let go of the clipboard she had been gripping like a lifeline, setting it down on the counter with an exhale that sounded like she was trying to let go of the moment itself. Her eyes darted across the room, taking in the overturned chairs, the shattered glass, the drops of blood smeared along the floor where Tony had collapsed after Graves shattered his nose. EZ was still by the door, his stance loose, but not relaxed. Not yet. His knuckles were raw, his shirt slightly wrinkled where Slade had grabbed him during the scuffle, but his focus wasn't on himself. It was on the street outside. He stood with his arms crossed, eyes scanning the darkening sidewalk through the clinic's front windows, watching for shadows that hadn't yet returned. The first sound after the fight came from Dion Carter, who let out a sharp breath, wincing as he pressed a hand to his ribs. "I don't know if I should be relieved or scared," he muttered. Graves didn't look at him, still surveying the damage, still cataloging the injuries that weren't physical, the way the waiting patients were slowly, cautiously moving again. The woman near the corner murmuring reassurances to her son. The teenage boy still gripping the back of his chair like it was the only thing keeping him upright. "You should be both," Nia muttered, rubbing a hand over her face before gesturing toward the mess around them, "because they're not just going to let this go." Before Graves could respond, the distant wail of sirens cut through the thick silence, the flash of red and blue lights bouncing off the clinic windows. EZ exhaled sharply, shaking his head as he glanced at Graves. "Here comes the cleanup crew," he muttered. Late, as usual. The door swung open, and Detective Luis Herrera stepped inside, his expression lined with irritation and exhaustion. A man who had spent too many years in the trenches of this city, Herrera had the look of someone who had long since abandoned the idea of stopping the tide. Now, he just tried to steer it away from total collapse. His suit was wrinkled, the sleeves slightly rolled up, his tie loosened just enough to show how tired he was of conversations like this. He stopped just past the entrance, his sharp gaze sweeping over the room, his trained eye absorbing every detail, the overturned chairs, the blood, the expressions of the people inside. Herrera sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose before finally speaking. "You want to tell me what the hell happened here?" Graves exhaled slowly, crossing his arms as he leaned slightly against the reception desk. "A disagreement," he said, his voice calm, almost bored. Herrera let out a slow breath, looking down as he adjusted his sleeves. "Rico and his boys got picked up 2 blocks down, pulled over in an alley, looking like they just went 10 rounds in a back alley brawl. You wouldn't happen to know anything about that, would you?" Nia scoffed, crossing her arms. "Maybe you should ask them what happened, instead of coming in here like we're the problem." Herrera's gaze flicked to her, then back to Graves. "They're not talking. No complaints filed, no weapons recovered, no statements made. So, officially, I got nothing." Graves exhaled, already knowing where this was going. Herrera lowered his voice slightly, speaking only for him now. "But, unofficially? You just humiliated them. And men like Rico don't let things like that slide." Graves didn't flinch. He knew this already. "They're going to come back," Herrera continued, his tone unreadable. "And when they do, it won't be for supplies. It'll be to burn this place to the ground. You should shut this place down for a while." Graves looked at him then, something colder settling behind his eyes. "You know I'm not doing that." Herrera exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "Then you'd better be ready, because next time they won't just be looking to make a statement. They'll be looking for payback." A heavy silence settled between them. Then, without another word, Herrera turned and walked out, the police lights flickering one last time before the squad car pulled away, disappearing into the city like it had never been there. The clinic remained still, the tension lingering long after the detective was gone. Nia shook her head, pacing slightly before finally stopping, looking at Graves like he was the one who had started this mess. "We have patience, Malcolm," she said, her voice quieter now, but no less firm. "They come here because they don't have anywhere else to go. But if this place turns into a battleground, if you turn it into one, we won't be helping them anymore. We'll be putting them in the crossfire." She wasn't wrong. She also wasn't saying anything Graves didn't already know. EZ, still standing near the door, exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. "They're not going to stop, Doc. You know that, right?" Graves finally moved, rolling his shoulders slightly, his body finally acknowledging the strain of what had just happened. He ran a hand down the front of his coat, smoothing the fabric, then looked at both of them, his expression unreadable. "No," he admitted. "They're not." For a long moment, no one said anything. Then, finally, Nia turned back toward the supply cabinet, murmuring under her breath as she gathered supplies. EZ sighed and glanced back outside, watching the streets as the first traces of twilight settled over the city. Graves stood in the center of it all, already thinking about what was coming next. The last of the squad cars had rolled away nearly an hour ago, the echo of police radio chatter fading into the deepening night. The clinic was far from settled. Though the waiting room had been cleared, and the remaining patients had either gone home or been discharged, the tension had not left with them. Dr. Malcolm Graves stood near the shattered front window, surveying the damage under the dim glow of the emergency lights. Shards of broken glass littered the floor, catching faint reflections from the street lamps outside, while a few overturned chairs still lay where they had been knocked during the scuffle. The weight of the evening pressed into his bones, but he didn't let himself acknowledge it. Not yet. Nia had finally slowed, no longer moving with the frenetic urgency she had carried during the aftermath. Instead, she leaned against the supply cabinet, arms folded, fingers digging into her sleeves as she stared at the wreckage with an expression that teetered somewhere between frustration and exhaustion. EZ stood near the door, posture rigid, scanning the street through narrowed eyes. He hadn't spoken in the last 10 minutes, but Graves could feel the energy coming off him in waves. Coiled, ready, expectant. They all knew it. This wasn't over. The shrill ring of the clinic's landline shattered the quiet. Nia's head snapped toward it, her brows furrowing as if she already knew exactly who would be on the other end. EZ didn't move, his stare locked on the phone like it had just issued a challenge. Graves was the one to step forward. He picked up the receiver, pressing it to his ear without a word. There was silence on the other end, not the hollow kind of an empty line, but the kind where someone was there, waiting, measuring the moment before speaking. Then, finally, a voice slid through the static, smooth, deliberate, carrying the weight of a man who had never needed to shout to be feared. "Doc." Graves didn't respond. Pete let out a slow exhale, the sound more amused than irritated. "I heard you had yourself a little party tonight," he mused, his voice carrying the same eerie calm it always had. "Heard my boys walked in your doors and didn't exactly walk back out the same way." Graves's grip on the phone remained firm, his expression unreadable. "That's the problem with people like you," Pete continued, his tone almost conversational. "You get comfortable. You start thinking you don't have to play by the rules because you got a few extra hands in your corner. That's cute, Doc. Really?" He paused just long enough for the weight of his words to settle. "But let me tell you what's gonna happen now." Graves didn't need to hear it. He already knew. "You took something from me today," Pete said, the amusement in his voice giving way to something colder, sharper. "You embarrassed my people. You made me look weak, and I can't let that stand." Graves exhaled, his voice measured when he finally spoke. "You want your men stitched up? Send them in like everyone else. Otherwise, don't waste my time." There was a beat of silence. Then Pete chuckled softly, though there was no humor behind it. "You got balls," he admitted. "But you don't got enough." The line went dead. Graves lowered the receiver, but the weight of the conversation settled into his spine like iron. When he turned, Nia was already staring at him, her arms still folded, but there was something else in her gaze now. "Tell me I didn't just hear what I think I did." EZ exhaled through his nose, rubbing the back of his neck. "He's coming back," he muttered. "We all knew that. But now, it's official." Graves didn't need to confirm it. Pete wasn't the kind of man who made idle threats. The night had been long, but morning arrived indifferent to the chaos that had unfolded the evening before. The first hints of daylight seeped into the city, creeping between the gaps in worn-out curtains, casting a dull glow against the pavement outside the clinic. The streets carried the remnants of the previous night, scattered cigarette butts, discarded beer bottles, the occasional hushed conversation between the lingering souls who never truly slept. But for the clinic, something new had been left behind. Dr. Malcolm Graves arrived early, as he always did, his steps steady despite the exhaustion weighing in his limbs. The moment he turned the corner, however, he stopped in his tracks. Spray painted in thick, dripping strokes across the clinic's outer wall was a message. The letters crude, but unmistakably deliberate. "Operate under our rules, or we burn this place down." The bright red paint stood out like fresh blood against the faded beige bricks, its placement calculated, visible to anyone passing by. Nearby, shattered glass glittered on the sidewalk where one of the clinic's front windows had been smashed in completely, jagged edges still clinging to the frame like broken teeth. The remains of a liquor bottle lay in the gutter, the dark stain of whatever had been inside still fresh against the pavement. Nia Reynolds, who had arrived just minutes before him, stood a few feet away, arms crossed tightly over her chest, eyes locked on the vandalism as if willing it to disappear. When she heard his footsteps, she exhaled sharply, turning to him with an expression that was equal parts exhaustion and anger. "This is what we're dealing with now?" she muttered, her voice tight, edged with frustration. "Terror tactics? Petty threats?" Graves scanned the damage, his expression unreadable. "They're not threats," he murmured. "They're promises." She let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. "And what? We're supposed to just pretend this isn't happening? Go about our day like everything's fine?" Graves turned to her then, his gaze steady, grounding. "No one's pretending," he said, voice measured. "But we're not stopping either." Easy pulled up a few minutes later, stepping out of his car and taking in the scene with a slow, deliberate scan. His jaw tensed, his fingers flexing once before settling into loose fists at his sides. Without a word, he walked toward the clinic entrance and inspected the damage, crouching near the broken window. "They did this late," he muttered, running a hand over the remaining glass. "Smart. No witnesses. No cameras catching them in the act." Nia exhaled, rubbing a hand over her face. "So, what now? We just clean up and wait for round two?" Graves looked back at the graffiti, the warning etched into the walls of the place he had built, the place people depended on. The gang wanted him to react. They wanted fear. They wanted him to make the wrong move. Instead, he turned away, already moving toward the door. "Clean it up. Keep the doors open." Nia's expression tightened, but she followed without another word. Easy let out a quiet breath before pushing himself to his feet, shaking his head. "Doc," he said, "you know this isn't over, right?" Graves didn't stop walking, but his answer came firm, unwavering. "I know." The unease had been lingering all day, subtle but present, hanging in the air like a storm waiting to break. Even as the last patients filtered out and the clinic began winding down, Graves could feel it. By the time the clock neared midnight, Easy had remained posted near the front, his stance more rigid than usual. Nia had stayed later than she should have, though she hadn't admitted why, as if somehow, by being there, she could keep things from escalating further. The neighborhood had settled into its usual rhythm of nighttime noise. Distant laughter, the occasional rumble of a passing car, the hum of late-night conversations drifting from open windows. And then, in the distance, an engine roared. Not just one, several. The low, steady growl of multiple vehicles approaching, too fast, too deliberate. Easy's head snapped up, his entire body tensing as he turned toward the window. "That's them," he muttered, the weight of certainty in his voice. Nia barely had time to move before the first gunshot rang out. The crack of it sliced through the air like a whip, shattering the fragile peace of the night. Then another, and another. The sound was deafening, a rapid-fire spray of bullets tearing through the quiet, aimed not to kill, but to send a message. The glass of the already broken window exploded inward, shards scattering across the floor, the walls riddled with small, sharp holes where the bullets had torn through. The sound of tires screeching followed. Fast, urgent, gone. And then, as suddenly as it had started, it was over. The clinic had been spared, but just barely. No one had been hit this time. For several seconds, no one moved. Then Nia exhaled sharply, her hands gripping the edge of the reception desk so tightly her knuckles had turned white. "Jesus Christ!" Easy turned, scanning the damage, his breathing measured, but his eyes were dark, sharp. He ran a hand over his face before turning to Graves. "They're testing us," he muttered, "seeing how far they can push before you fold." Graves stood still, his eyes on the wreckage, his pulse steady, his expression unreadable. Nia finally turned to him, her voice quieter now, but no less urgent. "Malcolm, this isn't just intimidation anymore. This is war." Graves inhaled slowly, exhaled just as deliberately, his hands resting against the counter as he processed everything. The escalation, the warning, the next inevitable step. He already knew what was coming. And Pete knew that he knew, because this wasn't just a message anymore. This was the countdown to something worse. The smell of gunpowder still clung to the walls, lingering like an unspoken warning, a reminder that last night had not been a nightmare, but a promise. The drive-by had left its mark. Bullet holes in the exterior brick. Shattered glass crunching underfoot. The clinic transformed from a place of healing to a battleground, marked by violence. Dr. Malcolm Graves had spent the early hours of the morning patching up the front windows, boarding over the worst of the damage, while the waiting room remained eerily empty. Patients who had once trusted this place to be a safe haven were now hesitant, their absence a message in itself. It was working. Pete's pressure campaign, the graffiti, the broken glass, the bullets that had come dangerously close but not quite close enough, was designed to force Graves into a choice. The gang wasn't trying to destroy the clinic outright, not yet. They wanted him to fold first, to bend under the weight of fear. And then, just before noon, Pete called. The phone rang sharp and sudden, cutting through the oppressive silence of the waiting room. Nia Reynolds, still tense from the night before, didn't even bother looking at the caller ID. She knew, they all knew. She just didn't want to hear it. Graves was already moving, already reaching for the receiver with the kind of calm that shouldn't have existed under these circumstances. Lifting it to his ear, he said nothing. There was a brief pause before Pete's voice came through. Smooth, unhurried. Still standing, Doc? Graves remained silent, his grip tightening around the receiver. Pete chuckled, low and almost amused. I figured you might be too damn stubborn to walk away after last night, but let's not pretend you don't see where this is going. Another pause. You're outnumbered, outgunned, and out of time. You don't want to fight this war, Doc. You ain't built for it. Graves exhaled slowly, his voice measured when he finally spoke. Then what do you want? Pete hummed, as if considering. You already know. You stock what we need. You treat our people first. You stay in your lane, and we don't have a problem. Graves leaned against the counter, his fingers tapping lightly against the wood as he processed the demand. And if I don't? Pete's voice lost the last trace of amusement. Then expect a war. A click. The line went dead. Graves lowered the phone, his face unreadable, but the energy in the room had shifted. Nia wasn't unreadable. She was standing near the supply shelves, arms crossed, her breath just slightly unsteady. And then she snapped. This isn't just you, Malcolm. Her voice was sharp, the frustration that had been simmering finally boiling over. They're not just coming after you. They're coming after all of us. Graves turned to her, his expression unreadable. You think I don't know that? Then why the hell are you acting like this is your fight alone? Nia's hands tightened into fists at her sides. I didn't sign up to work in a war zone. I came here to help people, not get caught in the crossfire of whatever the hell this has turned into. Graves watched her carefully. You saying you want out? Nia opened her mouth, then closed it, her throat working as she struggled with the weight of her own words. Finally, she exhaled, shaking her head. She turned away slightly, her arms wrapping around herself. I don't know if I can do this, Malcolm. I don't know if I should. Her words hung heavy in the air, a silence stretching between them that neither was quite ready to break. Across the room, Easy shifted. His silence had been more telling than anything else. He had been listening, watching, but the weight pressing down on his shoulders was different. Graves turned to him. You've been quiet. Easy let out a breath, rubbing a hand over his face before shaking his head. Because I don't know what the hell to say. His voice was lower, thick with something more than just frustration. This ain't something that just stops, Doc. Pete ain't Rico. He doesn't lose. He's not gonna just take the L and walk away. He's gonna keep coming until he gets what he wants. Or he buries you. Graves watched him closely. And what? You think I should just give in? Easy let out a dry, humorless chuckle. Ain't what I said. He exhaled, shaking his head. But I don't see a win here either. Graves tilted his head slightly. And what? Are you thinking about going back? Easy stiffened, his posture tightening like a wire being pulled too tight. I didn't say that, but you're thinking about it. A beat of silence. Easy exhaled sharply, looking away, jaw clenched. I left that life for a reason, Doc. His voice was quieter now, heavier, but I know how this game is played. And if you think you can beat Pete on your own, you're lying to yourself. Graves studied him for a moment before speaking. "You're not that person anymore," EZ scoffed. "Yeah? Tell that to the people who still see me as nothing but a street soldier." Another silence settled, heavy and suffocating. Nia turned back, her voice quieter now, but just as sharp. "We need to do something, Malcolm, because I don't think we can take another hit." Graves inhaled slowly, exhaled just as deliberately. He had spent his entire life saving people. In the field, on the streets, in this very clinic. But now he was the one being forced into a choice that wasn't really a choice at all. Pete had drawn his line in the sand. The question was whether Graves was willing to cross it. The weight of the decision pressed into the walls of the clinic, stretching into every corner, suffocating in its quiet inevitability. Surrender or fight. There was no middle ground, and Dr. Malcolm Graves had never been the kind of man to surrender. The air inside the clinic was thick with tension, unspoken but tangible, lingering like the aftermath of a storm. Nia Reynolds had stopped arguing, but the silence between them carried more than words ever could. She had made her stance clear. She didn't want to be caught in a war zone. And easy? He hadn't outright said it, but Graves could see the conflict in his eyes. None of that changed what needed to be done. Graves stood behind the reception desk, arms braced against the counter, as he scanned the clinic with the eyes of a man no longer looking at a place of healing, but a battlefield. Every entry point, every blind spot, every potential vulnerability. He mapped it all in his head with the precision of someone who had learned these calculations under fire. They were coming. He had to be ready. Step 1. Securing the clinic. The first order of business was fortifying the doors and windows. The plywood hastily put up after the drive-by wasn't enough. He needed something stronger. EZ helped him reinforce the front entrance with metal brackets, securing the doors so they wouldn't be easily kicked in. The windows were boarded up with thicker panels, leaving only narrow slits to see through. The back entrance, the one used for emergency exits, was sealed except for a single reinforced access point. "This'll slow 'em down," EZ muttered, stepping back to assess their work. "But if they really want in, they'll find a way." Graves knew that. His goal wasn't to keep them out forever, just long enough to give him the advantage. Step 2. Weapons and supplies. Graves didn't keep guns in the clinic. He had seen enough war, enough bullet wounds, to know what they could do. But war didn't wait for ideology. It demanded strategy, so he made a call. An old contact, Ryan Porter, former Army buddy, now running a private security firm. The phone rang twice before a voice answered. Gruff, no nonsense, the voice of a man who had never quite left the battlefield, even if his boots weren't in the sand anymore. Porter. Graves leaned against the counter, rubbing the bridge of his nose before speaking. "I need supplies." There was a pause, a wait in the silence. Ryan Porter wasn't a man who needed explanations. He had served with Graves overseas, had seen what war could do to men, had watched as Graves had patched up soldiers while the fight raged around them. He knew the tone Graves was using now. It was the same one he had used before a fight. "You don't call for small things, Doc," Porter said finally. "So, tell me, who's knocking on your door?" "A local gang," Graves admitted. "They want my clinic, and they're not taking no for an answer." Porter exhaled slowly. "And you think you can hold them off?" "I know I have to," Graves replied, his voice level, measured. "I'm not rolling over for them." Another pause. Then Porter's voice dropped slightly, more serious. "You know how this ends, right?" Graves exhaled. "I know exactly how it ends if I do nothing." That was all Porter needed to hear. "All right," he said, his tone shifting into something more decisive, more tactical, the kind of voice he used when making supply runs in hostile territory. "What do you need?" "No firearms," Graves said immediately. "Nothing that turns this into a full-on war zone. Just something to even the odds." There was a slight huff of amusement from Porter. "So, you want to fight a gang without guns?" "That's new." Graves didn't flinch. "I want to fight them without losing my soul in the process." Another beat of silence, then. "I'll see what I can put together," Porter said. Meet me at the clinic in 4 hours. The line went dead. Graves set the phone down. And just like that, the line had been drawn. Porter arrived that afternoon, his truck pulling up discreetly around the side alley. When he stepped out, he looked exactly the same. Broad, solid, carrying himself like a man who still expected enemy fire even in the middle of a city street. "You sound serious on the phone," Porter said, glancing at the boarded-up clinic. "Looks like I was right." Graves didn't waste time. "I need deterrence. Nothing lethal." Porter studied him for a moment before nodding. He reached into the back of his truck, pulling out a military-grade duffel bag and dropping it onto the clinic floor. Inside, smoke grenades, flashbangs, reinforced zip ties, tactical batons. Enough to hold a line without crossing one. "This isn't Fallujah," Porter warned, watching Graves carefully. "Are you sure you want to do this?" Graves met his gaze. "I don't have a choice." Porter nodded once. "Then let's hope they blink first." Step 3. Calling in favors. Graves had built this clinic from the ground up, but he hadn't done it alone. The community owed him, and it was time to see who was willing to step up. By evening, word had spread. A handful of local business owners showed up, Dion Carter among them. He was still sore, still recovering, but he stood tall when he approached Graves. "You saved my life," Dion said simply. "I ain't got much, but whatever you need, I'll back you up." Graves nodded, accepting the offer without pretense. A few more men trickled in. Workers from the neighborhood, store owners who had been forced to pay protection money, even a couple of old-timers who had seen the Phoenix Syndicate tear through this place for years. None of them were fighters. But they didn't need to be. They just needed to stand. Nia watched all of it unfold, arms still crossed, her expression unreadable. "You really think this is going to work?" she asked finally. Graves didn't turn to her immediately. He looked over the clinic, at the people who had come. Not because they wanted to fight, but because they had run out of choices, too. "I think if we don't do this now," he said, his voice steady, "there won't be anything left to fight for later." Nia didn't respond, but she didn't leave either. Step 4. The hardest choice. As the night settled, the last preparations were made. Easy remained near the entrance, his face shadowed beneath the dim clinic lights. He had been quiet the whole night, but Graves had felt the shift in him. Finally, Graves approached. "You know if you walk in there, they'll take you back," Graves said, watching him. "And maybe that buys us time. Maybe it gets us information we don't have." Easy exhaled, shaking his head. "Or maybe it gets me killed." Graves nodded slowly. That was the risk. A long silence stretched between them before Easy finally spoke again. "But if I don't go, I don't know if we will make it through this." Graves didn't like it, but war didn't wait for comfort. "Then, do what you have to do," Graves said. "Just don't forget which side you're on when it's over." Easy looked at him then, something solid settling behind his eyes. He nodded once. "I won't." Graves didn't know if that was a promise or a warning. Either way, the next move belonged to Pete, and Graves would be waiting. The clinic had become something different overnight. Not just a place of healing, but a fortress. A place waiting for the inevitable storm. The doors had been reinforced, the windows boarded up tighter than before, and the few loyal hands Graves had left moved like people who knew what was coming. But even with all the preparations, there was no mistaking the shift in the air. People had stopped showing up. The waiting room, once constantly filled with patients in need, was now nearly empty. Word had spread that the clinic was a target, that just being near it put lives at risk. The neighborhood had seen what happened to people who crossed the Phoenix Syndicate, and fear had taken hold. And then came the final warning. The smell of smoke came first. Graves had been in the supply room when he heard the shouting from outside, the unmistakable panic in the voices that told him something was wrong. He moved fast, pushing through the hallway, already catching the faint scent of burning plastic, melting rubber. By the time he stepped out onto the sidewalk, the fire was fully raging. The clinic's van, the only vehicle they had to transport critical patients to nearby hospitals when necessary, was engulfed in flames, black smoke billowing into the morning sky like a signal fire. A small group of onlookers had gathered at a distance, their faces etched with the same uneasy resignation that had taken hold of the entire block. This wasn't just a message. It was a public display, a final warning meant for everyone to see. Easy stood near the curb, fists clenched, his jaw tight as he watched the flames consume the vehicle. Nia was a few steps behind him, her arms folded tightly across her chest, her expression unreadable, but her body tense with barely contained frustration. Graves didn't stop moving. He stepped toward the burning van, taking in the damage, measuring the intention behind it. They could have hit the clinic itself. They could have torched the building, forced his hand completely. Instead, they had burned something that could be replaced, but not easily. They weren't trying to destroy him yet. They wanted to make sure he understood exactly what was coming next. "They're watching," Easy muttered, not looking away from the flames. Graves followed his gaze, scanning the surrounding buildings. There were eyes in the windows, watching from the shadows, waiting to see if this was the moment he would break. Nia exhaled sharply, her voice tight. "So what? We just pretend like this didn't happen?" Graves didn't answer immediately. Instead, he took a slow step forward, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out his phone and called the fire department. Then, without a word, he turned and walked back inside. No reaction, no fear, no acknowledgement of defeat, because that was the one thing Pete needed to see, the one thing he couldn't stand, and that was exactly why Graves did it. The fire had barely finished smoldering before the second move came. The message had been delivered. Now came the terms. Rico showed up mid-afternoon, alone this time, dressed cleaner than usual, like a man sent to handle negotiations. He didn't try to force his way in. He didn't bark orders. He simply walked through the front door like he belonged there and leaned against the counter, his smirk just barely in place. Graves met him at the reception desk, arms crossed. "You think this is still a conversation?" Graves asked, his tone even. Rico chuckled, shaking his head. "Oh, it ain't a conversation, Doc. It's a courtesy." He glanced around the empty waiting room, his smirk widening. "Looks like people are already making their choice, huh?" Graves didn't blink. "Get to the point," Rico sighed, as if disappointed. "Pete wants to be fair about this. You had your fun, made your little stand, but now, it's time to be smart now, Doc. If you want to keep this place open, it's gonna be under our protection. You need to follow our terms. That means supplies get set aside for us. When we need treatment, we don't wait in line. You don't call cops when things get messy." Graves leaned forward slightly. "Whatever you do, you still cannot change my mind. I ain't following your terms." Rico's smirk disappeared. "Then the next fire won't be in the parking lot." The silence between them was thick, heavy, full of understanding. They both knew exactly where this was headed. Graves exhaled through his nose, slow and deliberate. "Tell Pete he should have burned it all down last night," he said finally, "because he's not getting what he wants." Rico studied him for a moment, as if trying to decide whether he respected the answer or found it incredibly stupid. Then, without another word, he turned and walked out. The sun was setting when Nia finally let go of the words she had been holding back all day. "You're out of your damn mind," she snapped, slamming the supply room door behind her as she stepped inside. "You could have ended this today. You could have stopped this before it gets worse." Graves was at the counter, going through what little medical supplies they had left. He didn't look up. "You think Pete would have let us walk away? I think you didn't even try." He turned then, meeting her glare with something unreadable. "Are you leaving?" The silence that followed was sharp, painful, real. She exhaled, looking away. "I don't know." That was an answer in itself. She left the room a moment later, not slamming the door this time. And that was worse. Easy found Graves near the back entrance, watching the street. "I made my move," Easy muttered. "Word's already out. They know I'm coming back." Graves didn't react. "And?" Easy exhaled, rubbing his jaw. "And they think it's a good idea, which means it's probably a bad one." They both knew it was a risk. "Are you sure you can do this?" Graves asked, Easy let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. Nah, Doc, but we're out of choices, aren't we? Graves didn't answer, because they both knew the truth. Tomorrow, the war starts for real. The night was suffocating, thick with anticipation, and the kind of tension that refused to settle. The city moved on as it always did, unaware of the war brewing in the shadows. But within the clinic, everything felt different. The waiting room, once a space filled with quiet resilience, now carried the weight of something heavier, something more dangerous. The people who had come here for help had started keeping their distance, not because they had lost trust in Graves, but because they feared what being near him would cost them. Dr. Malcolm Graves had known from the start that this wasn't a fight he could win through sheer will alone. Pete wasn't an impulsive man, not like Rico or the others who followed him blindly. He was calculating, always 3 steps ahead, and every move he made was designed to strip away choices until surrender became the only rational outcome. It had been almost 24 hours since EZ had walked back into the world he had tried to leave behind, and the silence that followed was becoming unbearable. There had been no messages, no signals, nothing to suggest that things had gone according to plan, or if they had gone sideways the moment he stepped back into Pete's territory. Graves knew better than to assume anything, but every passing hour made it clear that whatever was happening, it wasn't good. EZ knew better than anyone how to blend in, how to slip seamlessly back into a life he had sworn he would never return to. He moved through Pete's ranks with ease, not eager, not reluctant, just steady enough to be believable. He listened, observed, picked up on the whispers about what was coming, about how Graves had made himself a problem that needed to be solved. He kept his head down, played the role of someone who had finally come to his senses, someone who had been waiting for the right moment to stop pretending he could be anything other than what he was. But the problem with stepping back into a world like this was that no one ever really trusted a man who had already walked away once before. It didn't take long before the first signs of doubt started creeping in. A few questioning glances, subtle shifts in tone when people spoke to him, the way Rico watched him just a little too closely, like he was waiting for something to slip. And then, just like that, the act wasn't enough anymore. Rico had cornered him in the back of the warehouse, the dim lighting casting long shadows against the walls. He wasn't alone. A few others stood nearby, their presence not immediately threatening, but the message was clear enough. You really expect us to believe you just came back? No questions asked? Rico's voice was almost amused, but there was an edge to it that suggested he was past playing games. EZ met his gaze, steady but unreadable. I came back because I got tired of pretending I could be something else. Rico studied him for a moment, then let out a short laugh, shaking his head. See, I want to believe that, but there's a part of me that just doesn't buy it. He took a step closer, voice lowering. And you know what we do to people we don't trust? EZ didn't have to answer. He already knew. And that was when the first punch landed. The first sign that things had taken a turn for the worse came in the form of Nia storming into the clinic. Her phone clutched so tightly in her hand that her knuckles had turned white. The anger radiating off of her was only barely masking the undercurrent of fear beneath it. You need to see this, she said, voice sharp, clipped, struggling to hold back the frustration threatening to spill over. She shoved the phone toward Graves, who took it without a word. The video started playing. The footage was shaky, the lighting dim, but the image was unmistakable. EZ'd, tied to a chair, his face bruised, blood at the corner of his mouth, his left eye swollen shut. He wasn't speaking, wasn't struggling, just sitting there with an expression that carried something far worse than fear. Acceptance. Off camera, a voice spoke, smooth and measured. Pete, this is what happens when you send a rat into my house. The camera shifted slightly, revealing Rico standing beside EZ, a knife in one hand, the tip pressed lightly against his throat. Pete's voice came again, deliberate and slow. You wanted a war, Doc? This is what war looks like. A pause, just long enough for the weight of his words to settle. "Let's see if you're willing to pay the price." And then, just like that, the screen went black. Nia's breathing was uneven, her arms folded so tightly across her chest it looked painful. "So what's the plan?" Graves didn't answer immediately. His mind was already moving, already sorting through every possible option. He could feel the weight of the decision pressing against his ribs, the knowledge that this was exactly what Pete wanted. He wasn't just forcing Graves into a corner. He was giving him one last chance to fold. He looked at Nia, then at the boarded-up windows, at the empty waiting room, at the place he had built with his own hands. And then, finally, he spoke. "We get him back." The plan was simple. Get in, get EZ, and get out before Pete could tighten the noose. It was reckless, dangerous, almost suicidal, but there was no time for anything else. Graves wasn't about to let EZ become a warning carved into the walls of an abandoned warehouse. The warehouse loomed ahead, a monolithic structure of rusted steel and concrete, its walls thick with the grime of 100 crimes that had never seen justice. It stood on the outskirts of the city, tucked behind abandoned lots and cracked pavement, a place where things disappeared. People, promises, hope. Dr. Malcolm Graves moved through the shadows, his presence a Pete in the night. The air smelled of gasoline and metal, the distant flicker of neon signs barely reaching past the barbed wire fences. He had been here before, in a different time, in different places, war zones where the rules of engagement were nothing but a distant memory. The difference was that this time he wasn't here to save soldiers. He was here to save a friend. EZ was inside. He didn't have time to wait. Graves had studied their movements, spent the last few nights watching, memorizing every shift change, every blind spot, every detail that would determine whether this mission succeeded or ended in blood. Pete thought he was untouchable behind these walls, surrounded by his men. But Graves knew better. No fortress was impenetrable. The guards at the perimeter weren't professionals. They were gang soldiers, dangerous, unpredictable, but sloppy. They smoked at their posts, leaned against the walls, checking their phones, laughing too loudly into the night. They thought no one would come for EZ. They were wrong. Graves moved quickly, efficiently, without hesitation. He approached the first guard from behind, his steps controlled, deliberate. A sharp strike to the base of the skull sent the man crumbling before he could make a sound. The second saw movement too late. Graves slammed him into the wall, muffling his grunt with the crook of his arm, his other hand driving a precise strike to the ribs, then another to the throat. The man dropped, unconscious, before his body hit the ground. One by one he cleared the outer defenses. Not a sound. Not an alarm. Pete and his men had no idea death had just walked through their front door. The main entrance was too risky, too open. Graves moved toward the side loading bay, slipping through the half-jammed door that groaned slightly against its hinges. The interior was dim, the light from a single hanging bulb flickering weakly, casting long, warped shadows against the walls. The sound of voices reached him first. "Saw through his act the second he walked in here," Rico was saying, his tone laced with amusement. But underneath it, there was something else. Frustration. "He thought he was slick," another voice added. "Thought we wouldn't check his phone, huh?" Moving swiftly through the hall, Graves reached the edge of the main room, pressing himself against the cold steel of a rusted storage container. From here, he could see the setup. EZ'd, tied to a chair in the center. Bruises forming along his jaw, his breathing slow but steady. Pete stood a few feet away, arms folded, watching him with the patience of a man who had already decided the outcome. "I don't like traitors," Pete said finally, his voice calm, conversational. "And I sure as hell don't like people thinking they can play me." EZ exhaled through his nose, barely moving. His gaze remained steady, unbroken. "You really think the doc is coming for you?" Pete chuckled, shaking his head. "Nah, man, he's smarter than that. He knows there ain't no saving you." Graves moved. He stayed low, silent, his steps Pete-like, as he closed the distance between himself and the first man standing guard. A swift chokehold, a sharp twist, and the body slumped forward, unconscious before he could register what happened. Another guard. 2 precise strikes, one to the throat, one to the solar plexus. He barely felt them fall. Graves was already moving toward EZ. Pete heard the shift in movement, his head snapping up. His instincts were sharp, honed by years of knowing when the ground beneath him was shifting. But Graves was faster. The first gunshot rang out, the bullet barely missing as Graves lunged forward, using the confusion to close the final few feet. A fist connected with Rico's jaw, sending him staggering back. But Graves didn't waste time watching him fall. He was already at EZ's side, cutting through the restraints in one swift motion. EZ sucked in a breath, rolling his shoulders the second his hands were free. "Took you long enough." Graves didn't waste time with a response. Pete had regained his footing, his gun already raised. "You think this changes anything, Doc?" Pete's voice was cold, measured, but Graves could hear the crack beneath it. The first taste of uncertainty. Graves didn't blink. "Yeah, I do." Pete smirked, his finger tightening on the trigger. And then EZ moved. Still sore, still aching, but fast enough. He drove his elbow into Rico's gut, grabbing the pistol from his hand before shoving him backward. The shot rang out, but it went wide, shattering a hanging bulb overhead. The room plunged into darkness. Shouts erupted. Pete's men scrambled, confused, blind in the sudden void of light. Graves and EZ didn't hesitate. Using the cover of darkness, they moved through the chaos, slipping between the crates, dodging swinging fists, the sound of bodies colliding filling the space like a storm raging through steel. A gun went off. Then another. By the time the emergency lights flickered on, Graves and EZ were already outside, sprinting toward the fence. The cold night air hit them like a shock as they emerged from the warehouse's side entrance. Behind them, Pete's men were still scrambling to regroup. EZ groaned, pressing a hand against his ribs as they reached the alley. "I'm getting too old for this." Graves exhaled sharply, scanning their surroundings, making sure they weren't being followed. "Then try not to get caught next time." EZ chuckled, shaking his head. "Next time, let's not have a next time." Graves didn't respond, because he knew the war wasn't over. It had just changed shape. And Pete? He wasn't done yet. The gang came just after midnight. Outside, the neighborhood lay still, abandoned to the creeping shadows of the night. The usual city sounds had faded into an eerie, unnatural silence. No passing cars, no distant voices. Even the hum of the streetlights felt dimmer, like the world itself was bracing for the violence about to unfold. Dr. Malcolm Graves stood inside the clinic, his breath slow, controlled, the air thick with expectation. He had spent years learning to read the quiet before a fight, the shift in energy, the charged static that meant things were about to go from bad to worse. EZ crouched near the door, watching through a narrow slit in the barricade. He had counted at least 3 cars, heavy with men. Rico was at the front, pacing like a man who thought he had already won, barking orders Graves couldn't hear, but didn't need to. This wasn't about negotiation. This was about erasing resistance. Then came the first strike. A thunderous bang against the front doors rattled the barricades, splinters flying as the wood strained against the force. A second blow. Then a third. The gang wasn't playing games anymore. Graves exchanged a glance with EZ, both of them understanding the unspoken message between them. It was time. The doors exploded inward, and Rico led the charge, his men pouring in behind him with the raw aggression of men who believed they couldn't lose. They had numbers, weapons, and the momentum of a victory they had already declared in their minds. What they didn't have was control. The first smoke grenade went off as soon as they stepped inside. A burst of thick, gray fog swallowed the entrance, coiling around them like a living thing, turning their vision to nothing but shifting shadows and silhouettes. Confusion set in instantly. Shouts filled the room. "What the—" "Spread out!" But Graves was already moving. The first man through the smoke came in wild, a flash of silver catching the dim light. A knife. Graves sidestepped the initial lunge, catching the attacker's wrist and twisting sharply, forcing the blade loose before he drove his knee into the man's gut. He followed up with a swift, calculated elbow to the back of the head, sending him crumpling to the floor. Another came through the haze, swinging blindly. Graves ducked the sloppy punch, pivoted, and sent a devastating strike to the ribs, then another to the jaw. The man hit the floor before he even realized what had happened. Easy was holding his ground near the entrance, fighting with brutal efficiency. A man lunged at him, but Easy was quicker, catching him in a chokehold and using his own momentum to slam him headfirst into the side of the reception desk. The sickening crack of impact sent another body to the floor. Rico's men had stormed in expecting surrender. Instead, they found war. The smoke had begun to thin, but the damage had already been done. The gang had lost their advantage. Their initial charge had been broken, their momentum shattered against a wall of calculated resistance. But they weren't done yet. Gunfire erupted. Bullets shredded through the barricades, ripping into chairs, embedding into walls, sending splinters and debris into the air. Graves and Easy had already moved, ducking behind overturned tables, using the clinic's narrow hallways to force their attackers into bottlenecks. One of the gang members rushed toward the back door, trying to flank them. Graves saw the movement in his peripheral vision, adjusted instantly. He slipped through the smoke, emerging just as the man reached for the handle. Before he could react, Graves drove his fist into his throat, cutting off the startled gasp, then followed with a sharp kick to the knee, dropping him instantly. Another came at him from the side. Graves twisted, using the attacker's momentum against him, slamming him into a supply cabinet before delivering a precise, devastating strike to the solar plexus. The man wheezed, collapsing, hands clutching his stomach. But then, through the thinning smoke, Rico stepped forward. Blood stained the corner of his lip from an earlier blow, but his expression was steady, his stance solid. In his right hand, a knife glinted under the clinic's flickering lights. Graves met his gaze, already shifting his weight, already measuring every angle, every movement. "You should have stayed down," Rico muttered, wiping blood from his mouth with the back of his hand. Graves exhaled slowly, steady as ever. "So should you." Then, without warning, Rico lunged. Rico moved fast, the blade flashing toward Graves's ribs. But Graves had seen men like him before. Fighters who relied on raw aggression, who mistook speed for precision. He sidestepped at the last second, grabbed Rico's wrist, and twisted sharply. The knife clattered to the floor, skidding beneath an overturned chair. Rico barely hesitated before throwing a wild punch, but Graves was already inside his guard, blocking with practiced ease before countering with a brutal strike to the sternum. Rico staggered back, gasping, his face twisting in pain, but he refused to go down. He recovered quickly, lunging again, swinging wildly. Graves absorbed the first hit, a glancing blow to the ribs, before retaliating. A palm strike to the jaw sent Rico stumbling, but he caught himself, rage flashing in his eyes as he came back harder. The two men moved like opposing forces colliding at full speed. Every strike was answered with a counter. Every opening was met with a counterattack. It was raw, fast, brutal. No hesitation, no wasted movement. Rico threw a hook, but Graves blocked, pivoting into a sharp elbow strike to the temple. Rico recoiled, shaking his head, but refused to fall. He retaliated with a knee, barely missing Graves's ribs before swinging again. Graves absorbed the impact, used Rico's momentum against him, and drove him backward into the counter. Rico grunted in pain, but still refused to drop. His breathing was ragged, his body screaming for him to stop, but his pride wouldn't let him. "You think this is enough?" he panted. "You think you win?" Graves didn't respond. Instead, he ended it. A brutal, final strike. A precise elbow to the temple, the impact sending Rico sprawling to the ground. unmoving. As Rico lay there, unconscious, Graves exhaled slowly, turning toward the front door. Because he knew who was waiting next. And Pete wasn't going to fight fair. The air in the clinic was thick with smoke and sweat, the scent of blood sharp and lingering. The wreckage of the battle was everywhere. Overturned chairs, bullet-ridden walls, bodies sprawled across the floor, groaning or unconscious. Dr. Malcolm Graves stood near the reception desk, breathing steady despite the exhaustion settling deep in his bones. He had fought through everything. Wave after wave of men, the stench of gunpowder clinging to the air, the raw violence Pete's men had brought with them. But now, the real fight was about to begin. Behind him, Rico lay sprawled across the ground, knocked out cold, his body limp against the broken counter. The clinic was almost silent now, save for the distant sirens wailing in the night. Too distant. Too slow. They wouldn't get here in time to stop what was coming next. And then, the front doors swung open. Pete walked inside. He didn't rush, didn't move with the aggression of a man who had just watched his entire crew be dismantled before his eyes. Instead, he walked forward with the unshakable confidence of a man who had never once considered losing. His steps were slow, calculated. The long coat he wore barely shifted as he moved, his shoulders loose, his head tilting slightly as he took in the carnage. Graves didn't move. He didn't have to. Pete exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "All this," he murmured, voice smooth, untouched by the chaos. "For what?" Graves said nothing, his fingers flexing slightly at his sides. Pete clicked his tongue, taking another slow step forward. "I gave you chances, Doc. I gave you options. You could have taken the deal. You could have walked away." His eyes flicked down toward Rico, unconscious at Graves's feet. "But instead, you threw everything away for... what? Pride? Some bullshit idea of righteousness?" Graves exhaled through his nose, steady, calm. "I did what needed to be done." Pete let out a low, humorless chuckle. "And what exactly do you think you did?" He gestured around at the destruction. "You think this is victory? You think because you took down some foot soldiers, you win?" His smirk twisted, darker now. "I own this city. You think one fight changes that?" Graves tilted his head slightly. "You talk a lot for a man standing alone." The smirk vanished. Pete's eyes darkened, his shoulders squaring for the first time. The air in the room shifted. The moment of words had passed. Now, it was time for war. Pete moved first. He lunged forward, fast, faster than Graves expected for a man who usually let others do his dirty work. But Graves had spent years learning how to read a fighter, how to see the movements before they fully formed. He sidestepped, narrowly avoiding the first strike. But Pete adjusted instantly, following up with a sharp elbow aimed for Graves's ribs. The impact landed, jarring him slightly, but he absorbed it, countering with a swift palm strike to Pete's jaw. Pete barely flinched. He came back hard, throwing a brutal hook that Graves barely blocked in time. The sheer force of it sent him staggering back, and Pete didn't let up. Another strike, then another. Each punch was sharp, precise, meant to do real damage. Pete wasn't just some street thug. He was trained, controlled, dangerous. But so was Graves. Pete lunged again, throwing a wild right hook, and this time Graves caught it. He twisted sharply, using Pete's own momentum against him, sending him crashing into the reception desk. The counter rattled under the impact, but Pete was already recovering, already surging back toward him. They collided. Fists flew. 1, 2, 3 hits exchanged in rapid succession. A sharp knee to the ribs sent Graves stumbling, but he recovered just as quickly, driving a brutal elbow into Pete's throat. Pete coughed, but he didn't stop. The fight raged across the clinic, the walls shaking under the force of bodies colliding, of fists breaking through drywall, of furniture smashing under their weight. Graves was fast, but Pete was relentless. He caught Graves with a brutal uppercut, sending him staggering back into the overturned chairs. The world spun for a split second. Pete saw the opening and took it. He lunged forward, grabbing Graves by the collar, using his weight to slam him onto the ground. The back of Graves's head hit the floor hard enough to send a sharp burst of pain through his skull. Pete loomed over him, breathing heavy but steady. His lip was split, his knuckles bruised, but he still had that damn smirk on his face. "You fought hard," Pete murmured, rolling his shoulders. "I'll give you that." His hand drifted toward his waistband. A gun. No more games. No more fists. This was the kill shot. Graves didn't think. He reacted. A surge of movement. A sharp twist. His leg shot out, kicking Pete's knee hard enough to send him stumbling. Pete cursed, the gun slipping from his grip for a fraction of a second. And that was all the time Graves needed. He pushed up from the floor, driving into Pete with every ounce of strength he had left, tackling him hard enough to send them both crashing through the supply shelves. The gun clattered away. Pete tried to recover, but Graves didn't give him the chance. One strike, two, three. Each punch landed clean, sharp, designed to end the fight. Pete struggled, tried to block, but Graves was faster, stronger, more precise. One final blow, a devastating elbow to the jaw, sent Pete collapsing to the floor, unmoving. He didn't get back up. Graves stood over him, breathing hard, battered but victorious. Outside, the distant wail of sirens grew closer. For the first time, Pete had no words, only silence. And, for the first time, he had lost. The sirens grew louder, closing in on the clinic with the weight of inevitability. Blue and red lights slashed through the broken windows, flashing against the wreckage of the fight. The stench of sweat, smoke, and blood still lingered in the air, settling deep into the bones of the clinic like a scar that would never fully fade. Dr. Malcolm Graves stood over Pete's unconscious body, his breathing slow, controlled, but weighted by exhaustion. His knuckles were raw, bruised from the fight, his ribs aching from where Pete had landed his hardest hits. The adrenaline that had carried him through the battle was fading now, leaving behind only the cold reality of what had just happened. Behind him, Easy groaned, pushing himself up from where he had collapsed against the counter, his face bloodied but victorious. The last remnants of the gang lay scattered across the clinic floor, some moaning, others unconscious, their reign over this neighborhood crumbling into nothing but a failed memory. And then the police stormed in. The first officer through the door had his weapon drawn, eyes wide as he took in the destruction. The others followed quickly, their voices sharp, demanding control of a situation that had already been decided. "Hands where we can see them." Graves didn't move. He simply exhaled, rolling his shoulders, already feeling the bruises forming beneath his skin. The fight was over. Now came the cleanup. Two officers moved toward Pete first, rolling him onto his stomach, snapping cuffs onto his wrists. He barely stirred, his breath still ragged, his body limp from the beating he had taken. "You got him good," Easy muttered under his breath, wiping a line of blood from his brow. Graves didn't respond. His gaze locked on Pete as the officers hauled him upright. The once untouchable gang leader, the man who had spent years ruling the streets with fear, was now barely able to stand. The smirk that had been permanently etched on his face was gone, replaced by something else, emptiness. Pete lifted his head slightly, locking eyes with Graves as they dragged him toward the door. "You think this changes anything?" His voice was hoarse, cracked from the damage he had taken, but the venom in it remained. Graves held his gaze, unmoved, unshaken. "You already lost," he said simply. Pete let out a slow, humorless chuckle, shaking his head slightly as the officers forced him forward. "We'll see." The officers shoved him outside, and just like that, Pete was gone. As the last of the gang members were dragged out, the officers turned their attention to Graves and Ezid. The lead detective, Luis Herrera, stepped forward, his expression tight as he surveyed the damage. "Jesus Christ," he muttered, rubbing a hand over his face. You want to tell me what the hell happened here? Graves let out a slow breath, leaning against the counter. They came for a fight. We gave them one. Herrera let out a sharp, humorless laugh. Yeah, I can see that. He gestured to the wreckage, to the bodies being loaded into squad cars, to the bullet holes still embedded in the walls. You realize I should be arresting you, right? Graves met his gaze evenly. There was no fear in his expression. You won't. Herrera scoffed. And why's that? Graves tilted his head slightly. Because if we hadn't fought back, you'd be here for something else entirely. A massacre. Bodies in the morgue instead of handcuffed in the back of your cars. Herrera stared at him for a long moment, then sighed heavily, shaking his head. You're a pain in my ass. You know that? Graves smirked faintly. You're not the first to say it. Herrera exhaled sharply, then turned to one of the officers. Get statements. Make it clean. He shot Graves one last look. You got lucky tonight, Doc. Try not to push that luck any further. With that, he stepped away, barking orders to his team. The weight that had been pressing against Graves's chest finally eased, just slightly. They had survived, for now. As the officers finished clearing the scene, Nia finally stepped forward, her arms folded tightly across her chest. She had been standing near the back the entire time, watching, waiting. You should be dead, she muttered, her voice sharp, but there was something else beneath it. Relief. Graves rolled his shoulders slightly. Should be. Ain't. She let out a short, exasperated breath before shaking her head. You're impossible. Easy chuckled beside him, still holding his ribs. That's what makes him fun. Nia shot him a glare before looking back at Graves. So what now? Graves exhaled slowly, scanning the wreckage of the clinic. The damage was extensive. Walls riddled with bullet holes, furniture broken beyond repair, medical supplies scattered and destroyed. The place he had built, the place meant to heal people, had become a battlefield, but it was still standing. We rebuild, he said simply. Nia studied him, her gaze unreadable, then nodded slowly. You really think people are going to come back after this? Graves met her eyes. They will. They don't have anywhere else to go. She let out a slow sigh, rubbing her temples. Guess that means I'm staying then. A flicker of something lighter passed through Graves's chest. A win, a small one, but a win nonetheless. EZ smirked. Yeah, you'd miss us too much. Nia rolled her eyes, but didn't deny it. The three of them stood there for a long moment, taking in the aftermath, the wreckage, the weight of what they had survived. The war was over, but the fight was never really done. And Graves was ready for whatever came next. The first patient arrived the next morning. It wasn't anything serious, just a young mother with a toddler who had a persistent cough. She hesitated at the door, glancing at the boarded-up windows, the lingering scars from the fight that had nearly destroyed everything. But when she saw Dr. Malcolm Graves standing behind the reception desk, his sleeves rolled up, clipboard in hand like it was any other day, she stepped inside without a word. By midday, more followed. An elderly man who had run out of blood pressure medication, a teenager with a deep gash in his arm from a bike accident, a father bringing in his daughter with a fever that wouldn't break. They trickled in one by one, no longer avoiding the clinic, no longer treating it like a place where danger lurked. They had seen the destruction. They had heard the gunfire, the sirens, the chaos that had threatened to swallow this place whole. But they had also seen Graves fight. Not just for himself, for them. By the afternoon, the waiting room was full again. Not as packed as it once had been, but enough to tell Graves that the community had made its decision. They weren't abandoning him. The clinic wasn't just a medical office anymore. It was something stronger. It had survived the war, and so had they. Graves moved through the rooms, treating patients as if the last week hadn't turned his life upside down, as if he hadn't spent the past few nights fighting like a soldier instead of healing like a doctor. His ribs ached, his knuckles throbbed, and every step reminded him of the injuries he had taken in that final fight with Pete. But he never once stopped moving. He barely even registered how people looked at him differently now. Before, he had been just a doctor. A good one, a trusted one, but still just a doctor. Now, he was something else. A protector. A man who had refused to let fear dictate what happened to his people. They didn't just come to him for medicine anymore. They came because they knew he wouldn't let anything happen to them. As the sun began to set, Graves finally took a breath. Stepping outside for the first time all day, the sky was streaked with orange and violet, the city settling into the golden haze of dusk. He leaned against the clinic's doorway, watching the street that had almost been his grave. It was quieter now, safer. Nia stepped out beside him, arms crossed, a tired smirk playing at the edges of her lips. "Busy day?" she muttered. Graves exhaled, rolling his shoulders slightly. "Yeah." She was quiet for a moment, then glanced sideways at him. "You ever think about what happens next?" Graves arched a brow. "You mean after this?" She nodded, looking out at the street. "We just took down one of the biggest threats in the city. That kind of thing doesn't just disappear overnight. There's always going to be something else. Another gang, another fight." Graves exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. "I know." Nia hesitated before speaking again. "You ever think about leaving?" Graves didn't answer immediately. He had thought about it before, late at night, in those rare, quiet moments when exhaustion pressed in too hard, when the weight of responsibility felt like too much. He could leave, start over somewhere else, a new clinic, a fresh beginning, far away from the blood and the violence. But then he thought about the people inside, the people who had come back, who had chosen to trust him, the mother with her sick child, the old man who needed his medication, the teenager with the busted arm. If he left, who would take care of them? Graves shook his head. "This is home." Later that night, when the clinic had finally emptied out, Graves sat at his desk, the dim glow of his lamp casting long shadows across the room. A folder lay open in front of him, filled with old medical reports, financial records, the history of the clinic, of every battle fought to keep it standing. At the bottom of the stack, beneath all the paperwork, was a photo. A younger version of himself, dressed in military fatigues, standing beside a group of men who were long gone. Brothers in arms, a past he had buried, but never forgotten. He traced a finger along the edge of the photo, his mind drifting back to the battlefield. The screams, the gunfire, the endless cycle of trying to keep people alive in places where death was the only certainty. He had left that world behind. Or at least, he had tried. The war had followed him home. But here, he wasn't fighting for governments, for policies, for missions written by men in offices thousands of miles away. Here, he was fighting for something real, something worth protecting. He closed the folder, leaning back in his chair. Outside, the city moved on. Inside, the clinic remained standing, stronger than before. I hope you enjoyed that story. Please share it with your friends, and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. In the meantime, I have handpicked 2 stories for you that I think you will enjoy. Have a great day.